Hello, welcome back to our series on our Anglican heritage. In particular, we're in the midst of a sub-series on more modern currents that have shaped the face of Anglicanism today. Last time we looked at John Wesley in the Evangelical Revival. This time we'll look at the Oxford movement and the rise of Anglo-Catholicism. So starting with the Oxford movement, picking up in the early 19th century, we see in Oxford, England, around the university, a new movement arise in the Church of England. This movement sought to renew the church by reconnecting it with the theology and tradition of the early undivided church. So by that, I mean the Oxford reformers very much were part of the Protestant tradition. They acknowledged that the Church of Rome had gone too far, acknowledged the need for the English Reformation, and yet they believed that the English Reformation had in some ways gone too far, had thrown out the baby with bathwater, if you will. They thought in particular the reformers had jettisoned too much of the heritage of the early church fathers. So they wanted to go back and reclaim some of the church's patristic heritage that the English Reformation had lost. Additionally, the Oxford reformers were deeply concerned about something called Erastianism, by which I mean that the church was increasingly becoming a creature of the government, subject to government control, existing for the benefit of the government, and therefore was subject to governmental control and interference. Finally, we can note that many of the Oxford reformers were initially part of the evangelical wing of the church. Over time, however, as a result of this movement, a lot of their views on the nature of the church and the sacraments changed rather dramatically, such that they often ended up at odds with the more evangelical, low church wing of the Church of England. Now, historians trace the beginning of the Oxford movement to 1833, when John Keble gives a very famous sermon at Oxford, criticizing laymen in the government who were trying to reform the Church of England. He saw this lay governmental interference in the church as what he called a national apostasy. And instead, he called for a return to an understanding of the church as something that was essentially divine in its character and composition. The Oxford movement really gets going, though, with the publication of a series of popular pamphlets entitled Tracts for the Times, published between 1833 and 1841. And collectively, these tracts called on the Church of England to return to its ancient roots in the apostolic period. Some of the most important of these tractarians would be the aforementioned John Keble, also Edward Pusey, Richard Hurrell Froude, and most famously, John Henry Newman. So just to survey the contents of a few of these tracts, so you can get a feel for where they were going. In Tract 1, Newman called on Anglican clergy to recover their rights by virtue of their ordination in the apostolic succession. And so reclaiming this vision of the clergy as rooted in the apostolic period, a ministry that had been passed down by the laying on of hands, calling people to recover a vision of the church as something more than just a glorified department of the state. Likewise, in Tract 3, Newman argued against any changes to the English Book of Common Prayer, warning against what he called the temper of innovation, that always wants to fiddle with things and try and make them better, but in reality loses some of the original precious heritage. Tract 18 is an interesting one, where Pusey sets out the benefits of fasting as prescribed by the church. So if you're interested in our discussions of the practice of fasting, you might want to look at that tract in more detail. Tracts 38 and 41 are particularly famous, written by Newman, in which Newman portrays the Church of England as the via media between Catholicism and Protestantism. And so in Newman's mind, Anglicanism is one branch of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Tract 67, Pusey makes a vigorous defense of the doctrine of baptismal regeneration, So if that's a topic you're interested in, you might want to look at tract 67. The most notorious of all the tracts is the last one published, tract 90, by John Henry Newman. Because in tract 90, Newman tried to show that the Anglican Articles of Religion, the 39 articles, written at the time of the Reformation against Rome, were in fact compatible with Roman Catholicism. So by this time, Newman had come to see the true body of Christ as the universal church, which included the Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern churches, and so on. This tract created quite an uproar, and in many people's minds up to the present day, it's viewed as a great example of special pleading. Nevertheless, Newman, the recipient of a fierce attack on tract 90, is compelled to resign his positions at Oxford. He goes into seclusion, and ultimately he's received into the Roman Catholic Church, one of the most famous converts from Anglicanism to Roman Catholicism in its history. And this is usually marked as the end of the Oxford movement. But nevertheless, these tracts were very, very influential in pushing the Anglican Church back to recovering elements of its ancient identity. So moving on later into the 19th century, in the wake of the Oxford movement, we can next talk about something called the Catholic Revival, often also called the Ritualist Movement. This kicks off over the issue of baptismal regeneration. There's a notorious legal case involved here, the Gorham case. But we'll skip over that to get into what this is all about, because ultimately, this will catalyze into a revival that has huge ramifications on the Church of England, not just in the 19th century, but into the present day. So for one thing, the Catholic Revival led churches to be built in a more neo-Gothic style and relied more heavily upon the traditions and practices of the early church. So we can see how these interests would align in many ways with those of the Oxford movement. In particular, this Catholic Revival draws heavily upon the Sarum rite, which was the dominant form of the liturgy in England prior to the 16th century. Even though it's similar in some ways to the Oxford movement, it is important to note that this ritualist movement or Catholic Revival does go well beyond the original goals and scope of the Oxford movement. And it ends up creating something that we would now call Anglo-Catholicism. So we'll unpack that in more detail. So the Anglo-Catholics will take a much higher view than many other Anglicans of ritual and sacramental life in the church. And the reason for this has to do in large part with the idea of the doctrine of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Because if Christ is in fact truly present in the bread and the wine, then this demands a certain degree of reverence for the altar and for everything around it. So for instance, we see these churches become increasingly filled with religious art. We see churches adding elaborate rood screens. These are what separate the altar area from the nave where the laity are. We find the installation of reredos, which are behind the altar, very ornate decorations behind the altar. These kind of things will be placed in these neo-Gothic or Gothic Revival churches built in the late 1800s. Other innovations that we can attribute to the Anglo-Catholics of the mid to late 19th century, the introduction of incense in the liturgy, the placing of lighted candles on the altar. We see clergy beginning to wear liturgical vestments rather than academic garb. We see clergy beginning to bow, genuflect, make the sign of the cross, perform ablutions. And probably what would make the biggest difference in people's observations of the liturgy, priests or bishops would celebrate the Eucharist ad orientem, meaning eastward facing or towards the altar. Before this, it was common to actually preside in the northern position, meaning sideways or perpendicular to the nave, people in the nave. You'll notice, by the way, that a lot of these practices are just considered common in many Anglican churches today, even ones that are not considered Anglo-Catholic. So the Anglo-Catholic influence, even though it'll continue down in this direction in ways that many Anglican churches won't follow, the Anglo-Catholic movement is responsible for a lot of these things that, again, you will find in many, even non-Anglo-Catholic Anglican parishes today. In the United States, we find that Anglo-Catholic bishops and clergy became very influential in our Protestant Episcopal Church. 1842, Nashotah House in Wisconsin was founded as a seminary to train seminarians in Anglo-Catholic theology and ritual. And so this Anglo-Catholic movement is on the rise in the United States, such that in 1873, some of these American Episcopalians who were objecting to some aspects of this Catholic revival actually broke off of the Protestant Episcopal Church to form the Reformed Episcopal Church, or REC. So this is where the REC has its origins. Anglo-Catholicism will continue to develop and progress in the United States. By the early 1900s, some of these Anglo-Catholic parishes will use what's called the Anglican Missal to supplement the Book of Common Prayer and bring it more into line with the Roman rite of liturgy. You also see increasing emphasis on devotion to Mary, devotion to the saints, things of that nature. So trying to evaluate the significance of the Oxford movement and then Anglo-Catholicism. So the Oxford movement makes a huge impact on Anglicanism, and it's an impact that we still feel very much at Christ the King. For one thing, the Oxford movement reversed a widespread neglect of the sacraments. So the Eucharist, thanks to the Oxford movement, is restored to its place as the central act of worship in the life of the church, becomes celebrated every week in a lot of parishes. Second, the Oxford movement was successful in recapturing a sense of the majesty of God and the importance of the church. So the church is not meant to be a lapdog of the state, but rather it's something that is the mystical body of Christ. And we treat the liturgy and the service with the awe and the reverence that God is due. Finally, the Oxford movement motivated mission in the slums of England's cities through building schools, churches, and social centers. And so when we think about things like mercy ministries, these should in fact be deeply connected with our life at the altar. So we don't need to separate having a high liturgy or a historical liturgy with these very practical works of good works. So the Oxford movement leaders were deeply involved in ministry in some of the worst places of England, and I think motivates us to do the same. Now, as for Anglo-Catholicism, Anglo-Catholicism remains a minority within the overall Anglican communion, but is still nevertheless a very influential stream of global Anglicanism today. So within the ACNA, which is the largest Anglican group in the United States and North America, you will find some Anglo-Catholic parishes, but really the so-called continuing Anglican churches that are outside of the ACNA, places like the Anglican Province of America or APA, this is where you'd find more of the real Anglo-Catholic parishes. So perhaps you visited an Anglo-Catholic parish at some time, perhaps not. But if you're familiar with some of these groups outside of the ACNA, like the APA or the Anglican Catholic Church, these would be good examples of Anglo-Catholic movements. So pulling this together, I think it might be interesting on the Zoom call to discuss this question of how does Anglo-Catholicism compare with Cranmer's vision for Anglicanism? Is this a continuation of Cranmer's ideas, or is it a contradiction of them? So that might be a good thing to spell out in more detail, and we'll see you next time.